I'll admit, I struggled a little bit with this one. I wanted this to be a fun, entertaining yet informative video, highlighting the things that Terra did right and the things that it currently does wrong. But out of all of the MMOs that I have played, Terra is perhaps the least recognizable to me in its current form. It has changed so drastically that it feels like an entirely different game. The leveling experience, the constant removal of content, the empty world. This game is a shell of its former self, but does that mean that we shouldn't play it? Hey, my name is Stakes, and welcome back to another episode of Is It Worth Playing? A video series where we analyze every facet of an MMORPG and come up with as objective of an opinion as we possibly can as to whether or not this title is worth playing in 2022. Today, we're taking a look at Terra. Terra was one of Mrs. Six's very first MMOs, an introduction to the genre for her. It was also my first action MMO, having come from games like Perfect World and Tales of Pirates and WoW. Quick shout out to our patrons over on Patreon. This allows you to directly support us if you're interested. Every patron will have their name appear at the beginning of every single YouTube video, and you'll be immortalized in the MMO genre forever. So, is Terra as bad as people claim it is in 2022? Now, it has been approximately a year since the last time both Mrs. Sticks and I played, or that we streamed this. We made it to endgame, to max level. We hit a point where all that was left for us to do was to essentially farm Vanguard quests in the open world and queue for dungeons. Or at least that's what it seemed like. On the contrary, we had access to a single dungeon, Messalarius Catacombs. This dungeon had an item level requirement of 512, which you're immediately gifted, as when you log in, they throw a full set of gear at you that gives you absolutely asinine amounts of stats. Wait, what? So the gear I had when I stopped playing was a +3 Kaya's Wisdom Arc Cannon, with an attack of 53,000 to 59,000. This new one that I got just for returning as a returning player, 120,000? The magic amplification of my old cannon, just a year old, 21,000. The magic amplification of the new cannon, 126,000. Yet still, somehow it doesn't get you to item level 513. Thus, you're stuck farming this one singular dungeon, which people continue to die in. I just want you to know, Eternal Ninja is, look at their health, again. They're literally permanently almost dead. Am I permanently almost dead? No, I'm not. I'm literally always fully healed. And they're dead again. Look, Eternal Ninja, dead. If they had given us that single digit increase in item level, the point between where players come back and endgame content would be achievable just so much easier. But that's essentially how you play catch up. One might find running a single dungeon to be too much of a repetitious, arduous grind, but it gets worse. To mix things up, you're given the option of doing daily Vanguard quests as well. Go to this max level zone and farm 10 monsters, to which you think to yourself, oh, you know what, that doesn't actually sound too bad, until you get there and you realize that even though the quests say solo, if you opt to tackle them solo, they take 10 minutes per kill. Are we serious right now? This is how long this is gonna take. No! I hate you. That has a 3-minute cooldown. That's okay, I'm gonna be here in 3 minutes anyway. Bluehole, seriously. Who at your development studio thought it was a great idea to make these monsters require 2,000 hits to kill? I'm gonna be 100% completely honest with you here. Nobody wants to spend 10 minutes killing one monster when I need how many? 9. I need to kill 9 monsters, which is the largest waste of time I have ever seen, even for someone with substantially better gear than me. Together, monsters took approximately 4 to 6 minutes. Whoever thought giving BAMs, big ass monsters, exponentially more HP than we have damage should not be allowed to design video games, because that is, for lack of a better word, stupid. Now, it wouldn't actually be too bad if the monsters required actual skill to combat, if they hit hard, or if they had mechanics that you're required to learn, but you literally just stand there cycling through your abilities and rolling out of an AoE every so often. Not that the damage was high enough to warrant moving for the vast majority of it. Disregarding what is arguably a horrible point to come back to the game, Terra was a gorgeous MMO. Once upon a time, it has continued to grow significantly more dated visually. The zones seem flat. There isn't really anything to them. There's nothing to explore. There's no real reason to even. The introduction of flying made it so much worse, as the game world was not built for flight as a form of exploration. The world from up high is ugly, it's jagged, it's pixelated, character animations feel less polished than they did a few years ago. And don't get me wrong, this game still pulls off the Korean attempt at a medieval fantasy aesthetic well. Today, there are only a handful of different MMOs that look better and fit the same style, the same theme, but given games we see these days, this would be the bad introductory title for a new MMO player. Thankfully, while the game might look dated by today's standards, it definitely doesn't feel dated. On the contrary, Terra has some of the best action combat of any MMO in 2022. Sure, some people might go ahead and argue that Bleeding Soul or maybe Black Desert have better combat, maybe even PSO2 New Genesis, but Terra took a traditional combat system where you're able to keybind your abilities to your numbers, to your letters, and cycle through them in whatever rotation you feel comfortable with, as opposed to Black Desert or Bleeding Soul, which give you a much smaller selection of abilities and often have button combinations like Shift plus Strafe plus A plus D. After performing a successful parry against 2 or more monsters, yeah, that is too complex for me. I rather have something like hit number 2, hit number 3, hit spacebar to do a rolling reload, then hit number 2 again, hit number 4. Maybe it's because I'm old, but I prefer more simplistic approaches that don't require I memorize hundreds of different button combinations that vary depending on which situations are or are not met. The special effects aren't overly flashy. They also don't really feel too impactful, but every class does, for the most part, look and feel relatively unique. As I noted, the world is kind of empty. You'll find hordes of monsters spread through somewhat larger areas. You'll have Vanguard quests to take to eliminate X number of them, which gains you XP and a selection of items, potions, currency. A lot has been removed from the game, so the world functions as a means with which to push you from story NPC to story NPC, but given the speed with which you level, questing seems almost like a redundant feature, as does the world itself. You either opt to level by entering dungeons by yourself, as most of these dungeons until max level are doable solo, or you queue for a dungeon and hope that somebody else is too to make things faster. Regardless, you obtain so many level ups via running dungeons that it eliminates any need for any other content. While the world was at one point filled with side quests, filled with story quests, filled with just players running groups to fight BAMs, now it's just this empty, barren wasteland. I wish there was a reason, an incentive to go back out into the world, but there just isn't. At least not from what I have experienced personally. And unless you can make it past that asinine introductory grind to reach endgame, you likely won't find a reason to either. I did note that the world used to be a little more filled with content. Some of that content took the form of story. Terra wasn't always so disconnected, so difficult to understand as it is now. Once upon a time, Actually, you know what? While the game has always had a form of story, and I know this might come off as a bit of a contentious opinion, but its narrative was always kind of bad. This is coming from a founder and someone who loves narratives in their games. There were certain recurring characters that you'd find over the course of the game, but unlike Final Fantasy XIV, which is about half narrative, half gameplay, Terra was approximately 2% narrative, 98% gameplay. It had one, you just don't really remember what it was. There was a guy named Elyon, I think? Some big booba elven lady that was in a city surrounded by water? That old trader guy? Yeah. And if the story before was mediocre, was forgettable, imagine what it is now after they spent years slowly truncating the experience. Then again, it is a Korean MMO, and outside of Blade and Soul and Lost Ark, I haven't ever really encountered a worthwhile story within a Korean MMO. Now, I did make it sound like there really isn't anything to do in the game, and on the contrary, there's a lot to do in the game. There just isn't really any purpose to really do it, nor anyone actively participating in the content to actually consume. As an example here, there are battlegrounds. I have not been in a battleground in what seems like years, because whenever I would queue for it, it tells me that the number of players queuing are low. And even doing a 4-hour stream over on Twitch never really ended up having a single queue successfully pop. While there is a PvP system in place, nobody really participates in it anymore. Back when I started TERA, I played on an open world PvP server, and while I recall being camped outside of Lumbertown by higher level players, it made for a sense of accomplishment whenever you would manage to escape a group of griefers. But it also left it open for open world engagements with other players your own level. It required you to pay attention to your surroundings, as you'd never really know who you could trust or when things would go south. I mean, sure, there is the Kumas Royale. Wait, actually, you know what? There was the Kumas Royale. When logging in the most recent time, which was actually just a few days ago, I couldn't locate it. Did it get removed, or is it set on some type of rotation or something and I was just blind? Regardless, then we have dungeons. I recall dungeons used to be catered to larger groups, 5-player or maybe it was 6-player dungeons. They've since been altered to allow for 3 players to cooperatively tackle, which makes sense given the population issues the game has. Dungeons are honestly one of the better aspects of the game, and they're honestly one of the better aspects of a lot of games. They look pretty good. Some of them are actually enormous inside. They feel unique. Bosses can range from being a cakewalk to actually requiring your attention, although the game, including dungeons, suffers from HP bloat. The devs thought to themselves, oh, you know what? Dungeons are too easy. Instead of making them more challenging, let's just increase their HP. And I feel like that is a sentiment that is echoed throughout the entirety of the game. Instead of actually taking the time to understand what specifically was wrong with the game, what needed to actually be improved upon, they responded with, just to add more HP. That right there is going to keep player attention, right? Then we have Vanguard quests, BAMs, professions like alchemy, smelting, processing, etching, and cooking. At the end of the day, TERA has the potential to be a fantastic MMO. It actually was a fantastic MMO once upon a time. The game still looks good a decade later. The combat is arguably better than the vast majority of titles present in 2022. Heck, it still provides a better action combat system than MMOs released in 2021, like Bless Unleashed, like Astelia, like Elion, and even with Elion supposedly being the spiritual successor to TERA, this game just feels better. It runs better. It plays better. The world is more dull and it feels like there's a lot less to do, but given Alion's population issues, I feel TERA averages more active players after a decade than Elion does after a mere 6 months. If this game had a competent group of developers that instead gave players what they wanted, as opposed to catering to the ever-declining whales, this would still be one of the top MMOs presently. Kinda like how RuneScape, decades later, still averages hundreds of thousands of active players every month. Is this the greatest MMO? To some people, sure. To me though, no. Honestly, this still has one of the best combat systems out of any MMO in my opinion. Graphically, it looks and feels much more dated than I remember, and this continues to get worse every year. The narrative, what remains of it anyway, is incredibly underwhelming. The world is large and open, but there's nobody inhabiting it, nothing to really warrant, well, doing anything within it, which is why everyone is AFK in 2 of the town hubs. There is admittedly plenty of things to do in the game, there's just nobody really doing any of it. Honestly, I ended up rating this higher than I thought I would. In its current form, TERA is a passable MMORPG. It is a very hollow shell of what it once was, and will likely continue to decline into obscurity until Gameforge, the only Western publisher for the game now, shuts it down. And given the current population numbers that we're seeing, that could ultimately end up being much sooner than we think. Now, if you're interested in my thoughts on other MMOs, you can go ahead and click my last video in the series over here, or you can go ahead and click the video right here for a list of 10 MMOs that you might be interested in.